Hey, folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Today, we're going back down to Baltimore, Maryland, site of some of my favorite distilleries right now in the US, especially in the craft scene. And we're here to talk to Baltimore Spirits Company, and specifically their founder, CEO, Max Lents. So, Max, welcome on.
David, thank you for having me.
So, again, Baltimore is one of my favorite cities, particularly, I was going to say particularly for rye, but that's not even true. For many spirits, brown spirits in the craft scene. And before we get into it, I just wanted to give a shout out to Mark over at Old Line Spirits, who's been on the podcast twice and was nice enough to make the intro for us so that Max could come on as well. So, Max, you've done, you and your partners, but especially you have done many a podcast interview, other interviews in newspapers and other publications. And the reason I'm starting with this is, I promise, it's for a reason. Is you said recently on one of the ones I was listening to that you'd done a lot of interviews and articles in the Times and the Baltimore Sun, and but what had done the most for your reach and people knowing about Baltimore Spirits Company has been going to a farmer's market.
Yeah, certainly in terms of customers who've like come into the tasting room and said hi to me or visit, like people I've been around, like actual physical customers that I've known and met. So much of that has come through community touch points. So farmers markets, sometimes distillery gatherings, or every now and then a tasting in a local liquor store or something like that. And every now and then something like a cocktail dinner that we may partner with a restaurant in a city for. But certainly more than, and it's not that it doesn't happen, but a little more than the podcast, the New York Times article, the Chicago Tribune article, those things. I can't tell you that I met a single real customer or got a ton of emails outside of like my friends and family and people that already knew the company were super excited to see it there. But those community touch points are super important. And in terms of kind of real people in the world who end up being real customers who come to see you, the physical connection there is very strong.
Right. I think that's something we on both sides of the camera in this case kind of struggle with. Like if I have someone on, it's because I find their story interesting, their product interesting, etc. And I want people to visit them, to try their spirits, to buy their spirits, if it's applicable. And so I got to ask, what are you doing on mine?
What are we doing? What now? On
Oh,
yours?
yeah.
Oh, I mean, the truth is I love podcasts. I used to run a podcast before I started the whiskey business, years before, a long form live, kind of comedy centric podcast, which was fun. It'd give me a microphone, whether be it on podcast or karaoke, and I'm a happy guy. So I love a stage, and I love telling our story. And even though farmers markets are great, but I love reaching new audiences, and each person has their own kind of community. And I do think that it's important for the snowball, the kind of slow acquisition of people hearing about us in multiple places. I think that kind of being touched in a few different places that you trust as a customer is a way where people start to become curious about the brand. And if they hear people they respect talk positively about the brand, or negatively, I think that really affects how they feel about it. And if they hear it from a couple of places, it can start to matter. So I think it just needs to be done as much as possible and in as many places as possible, really. But one single piece of PR is not the answer, because especially these days when content comes and goes very quickly, so it needs to be kind of a current piece that to continue mind share rather than some singular piece that changed your life.
Sure, absolutely. So had to ask that question first, of course, but going to the history of Baltimore Spirits Company, BSC might call it sometimes. So in the history of BSC, you are co-founder with two of your friends, Eli and Ian. It's been around since 2013. Got first spirits out in 2015. Is that correct?
All true.
Uh, oh,
2013, it existed so much in that there was giant stretches of white cardboard taped to our living room wall with threads connecting things like a murder mystery and
Mm.
names circled and phone numbers scratched out and big question marks. And so we wrote it on the wall in 2013. In 2014, we were incorporated and moved into a physical space. That's when truly the company began in earnest. And then 2015, we were finally distilling spirits.
So, in listening to the history of BSC, your own history comes into it. Your own reason for getting into distilling, and to me, there's something I think I hadn't quite heard, and I'm looking to explore it here, which is you became very interested in Maryland rye as this category that needed to be not only explored but revived. And I think for me, I'd just love to hear how you found that niche. How did you come across that?
Yeah, it's a funny thing. Where are you based?
Up in Queens, in New York City.
In Queens, yeah. So in 2008, 9, kind of my first years after college living in Baltimore, if you went to a dive bar, just a random side of the road bar, nothing, certainly nothing fancy. There weren't a lot of fancy bars in Baltimore at the time. And you ordered a shot of whiskey and you didn't specify, you were almost certainly going to be poured a shot of Pikesville rye whiskey. Uh, there is no other state in the United States, and maybe not really even a city outside of Baltimore. I think it was really, I think Baltimore was the epicenter. That was just pouring rye whiskey in 2008 randomly as a house shot. I mean, this is instead of Jack Daniels or Jim Beam. I mean, this is what these bars anywhere else would have been pouring if they weren't pouring like true plastic bottle rail shots, But rye never died here. Now, everyone who grew up in Maryland and lived here their whole lives, it was just normal to drink rye, and that wasn't really surprising. But as a visitor, you notice over time that everyone's drinking rye, and that's just not normal. I mean, this is back when, I think this is before when the Jim Beam distillery said they spill more bourbon in a day than they make rye in a year.
Mm.
Pretty sure that was Beam that said that back in the day, and that was when the rye like kind of whispers were beginning to start, and people were asking questions about it because it was kind of a new hot thing, and they weren't believers yet, and I think they certainly are now. But in Baltimore, it was just part of the culture, and that goes way back to when Maryland rye was a big deal. I mean, Pikesville left in the late 70s, early 80s, kind of depending on whether you're talking about production or the sales. They quit producing in the 70s, and then they actually moved the brand, I think, in the early 80s, but they hadn't been producing for a number of years. And before that, there were only a few since really the 50s that stuck around. So, but post-Prohibition, there was a huge influx of distilleries again, trying to kind of recapture that Maryland rye magic, which was, of course, a much bigger deal before Prohibition. But even though the distilleries couldn't financially make it stick, and a lot of that was just because there was an opportunity for a lot of the owners, and post-Prohibition, a lot of these distilleries were owned by out-of-state businesses, so they didn't have kind of ties to the land as much as the pre-Prohibition distilleries. So there was an opportunity to sell these famous brands like Pikesville, and then there of course there's the Pennsylvania brands too, and there's Rittenhouse and Old Overholt and all this stuff, to sell them to the big Kentucky distilleries, which were much larger and more financially stable operations, and so they just did. But even though a lot of the distilleries didn't financially make it and stick around here, the people just kept drinking rye because that is what you drank in Maryland. So it was hard to avoid, to be honest. I mean, I ended up managing a bar and restaurant, and so I was, I had been ordering the Pikesville for years as the bar manager, and certainly have had my share, and I still have some very precious to me white label Pikesville in my liquor cabinet, which they don't make anymore. Which is, of course, a funny thing because it wasn't good then. I mean, it wasn't special, at least. So now it's very special, but it's not good enough to like drink on the most special of occasions. You want something kind of higher end, but it's too special to just drink like it's water, which is what it used to be. So it's in a funny place, but I'm glad to have my bottles. And yeah, it says Maryland style rye whiskey on there, and so of course one question leads to another, and the history even on the internet back then was really sparse, and there's a ton of great resources now. But back in the day, I had to go and find like old PDFs from the Maryland Historical Archives when someone in the early 2000s wrote like a rediscovered history about Maryland rye, which no one had talked about for decades. So started there, and of course, along with many other distilleries across the country, you started to see some more information pop up, more research being done, a bigger story starting to unfold. And we're lucky to have kind of joined that in the beginning, where we could be kind of part of the discovery process, and help kind of revitalize it locally.
So going a little further even on that, in terms of Baltimore rye, Maryland rye, and the revival that's been going on with that. So Maryland was one of, I'm not sure if it was the only, but Maryland never ratified the Volstead Act.
It was the only, yeah.
It was the only.
47 out of 48 states at the time did.
Right. And they never had state prohibition either.
Correct.
So is there something, I don't know the right word, I guess, that I'm looking for, but maybe a little rebellious, stubborn, could be either one, about Marylanders and their rye in that way?
This is why, yeah, I mean, it was almost certainly. So this is why Maryland has the nickname the Free State. So it earned the nickname in Prohibition because it was the only state that didn't pass a local prohibition law to support federal prohibition. And that's also when Baltimore became known as the Wet City, which there's still a bar called Wet City, and you still see the term thrown around in various contexts. But, dry county, you're not allowed to buy alcohol. Wet City, very easy to find alcohol. So during Prohibition, Baltimore was a very easy place to drink. Still illegal. So the point was the local police would not enforce the laws, but the federal government would still come in and enforce it. So the feds were still here. They shut down the distilleries. Any distilleries operating were doing so illegally, and wouldn't have been like production plants, but probably more like illegal moonshine distilleries. So at some point, but I mean, there were some big operations here. At some point, the feds busted a still operation in the woods of Maryland and Western Maryland, and the still was so big it couldn't be removed. They had to blow it up with dynamite, which is kind of a fun little story.
Get rid of it.
But absolutely, I mean, Baltimore is rebellious. I think it was in the early 1800s or late 1700s where it first became known as Mobtown. So there's Mobtown Brewing, there's Mobtown Ballroom. Mobtown's another kind of Baltimore nickname you see applied to different things. And that's because I think it was the New York Times was relaying a story about how Baltimore mob gathered and ripped the front of a banker's house off to tar and feather him for not, paying out people's deposits or whatever. And it says like, Baltimore's always been a bit of a mob town. And that name stuck. So Baltimore just has some attitude and loves what it loves, and rye whiskey is deeply entrenched, for sure. And the kind of the alcohol culture here. I mean, it was not just socially, but at the government level during Prohibition, we thought it was a right for people to share drinks and be social, and I think that is still pretty pervasive in the social culture today.
So when you started production, as you were saying, in earnest in, let's say, 2014, you're maybe the third or fourth distillery in Maryland at that point with production. I know others were being built during the time, but
yep.
In production, third or fourth. When you're starting up, because there weren't a lot to look around to in terms of, hey, I can look at this brand, I can look at this distillery for some guidance. How did you go about figuring out what you wanted the business to be from both the idealistic standpoint, but also really the physical, like the still setups, things like that?
Yeah. Honestly, that's one of the things I think kind of helped create as unique of a place as we ended up being. Is the company did not grow up around the craft distillery culture that's there's a ton in Maryland. Like you said, I think we were the third or fourth actually producing distillery, and I think maybe the second or third distillery that produced rye. And I'm not positive that either of the ones before us are actually still producing rye. I know one of them is not. So we're really early. But when in 2013, when we were doing the business plan and sourcing equipment and things like that, there were 0 distilleries in the state. So it was really early. And we never really associated ourselves. And of course, we do now. We understand we're part of a culture, but we didn't associate ourselves then with the craft distilling movement. We did not, go visit. I think Virginia had some working distilleries. We didn't go visit and take notes and be like, oh, this is how you do this. We were inspired by the whiskeys that we loved deeply, and we made a lot of production decisions, mostly focused on what we thought would make the finest spirit. And we were obsessed with the idea of fine spirits making. Like in the beginning, we would always toss around, we want to make world-class spirits here in Baltimore. Now we don't say that anymore because essentially that's every brand new distillery's tagline. But at the time, nothing rang truer to us, and we were really trying to gear our distillery into making something. Just we wanted to make liquid gold, and we didn't know entirely how to do it, but that's why we ended up being a pot distillery. The favorite whiskeys in our lives were pot distilled spirits, and we knew that that's how the oldest ryes would have been made in Maryland. So we had a nice link to history there. We use wooden vat fermenters, so open wooden vat fermenters. Wooden vat fermenters are way sexier than steel fermenters and much easier to use than in, say, beer brewing. But we wanted to kind of create as much complexity as possible. So our whiskey recipe calls for 2 different yeasts. We do 2 separate styles of fermentation. It's the same grain mash bill, but 2/3 we use a Belgian ale yeast, 1/3 we use an American whiskey yeast. There's some papers out there that say Maryland distilleries back in the day used beer yeast more often than Pennsylvania distilleries, and the beer yeast produces a sweeter spirit when all the kind of esters in that fermentation just end up being a sweeter spirit and less dry. So we wanted to incorporate that. In the early days, we just partnered with a local brewery that we loved that focuses on Belgian beer, and after their post fermentation, we'd go draw off their late generation yeast off the bottom of their tank and lug it back to the distillery in kegs and dump it in our fermentation. And we're lucky that stuff worked out so well. So I think in some sense we got lucky because you don't know how whiskey's going to turn out when you put it into barrel unless you're a guy who's been in the business for a long time and you're using a similar system that you already used. But nobody's making whiskey like this and doing these, wooden vat fermentations into double copper pot distilling using a mash bill that's not a common mash bill. It's one that we kind of conceptualized and did some test batches in the moonshine and really fell in love with the spirit there. And we're using yeast that are just not generally used in whiskey making. Now, some of this has been recontextualized for us. We found that there was a distillery using almost the same mash bill. There was a pretty famous Maryland distillery. And we've also found another pretty famous rye producer, small but well renowned, that uses the 2 yeasts that we use as well. So we've kind of found our own context in the business, but most of the decisions we made early were not anything but original thoughts, but they were all geared towards trying to create a system that would produce the highest quality spirit we knew how to make. So we didn't really build a prototypical American craft distillery. It's not a hybrid still. It's not a column still. It doesn't efficiently use kind of small spaces and have great yields. It's a really low efficiency system. It's a low rectification still that we actually designed in terms of its shape. But the reward for low efficiency in distilling is high character spirit, which was really what we were after anyway. So what we ended up doing was building something that's maybe a lot more like a tiny Scotch distillery or a single malt distillery than what you'd think of as a modern rye distillery, which of course rye production is really industrialized these days. But even the craft producers are doing, there's kind of a model of craft producer that's very common, which is, the hybrid still. Sometimes it's single pass. Sometimes they'll do a run with the plates and then finish it as a pot still or whatever. There's everyone has their own method, and we don't think there's kind of a right or wrong. And I've had plenty of amazing whiskeys off that stuff, but we do some weird stuff.
And I know this is the stills that you're using. I like the idea of how you described it. The having a Scotch malt whiskey distillery, but making rye instead as the main grain. To compare the 2 styles, let's say, the York Dispatch did an article on you and Sagamore back in 2018. So it's been a few years back, but it was a few years into the business as well. And they highlighted you as the two distilleries bringing Maryland rye back, but in wildly different fashions. And somewhat so as you just described. Now, I'm a huge fan of Sagamore too.
Same.
And this is certainly no shot across the bow at them, but they just use a different process. They've got Penny, their very large column still that I got to visit. They started by sourcing. Again, nothing wrong with that either, and they've moved entirely to making their own product at this point. Now, once the still was installed.
Yep.
But obviously, you've taken the almost complete opposite approach of doing these pot stills. No, not even a hybrid, but straight pot still. And I guess what I would ask then is, as the business has grown, you're a little over a decade in. Do you find yourself looking at the distilleries around you, including or not including Sagamore, Old Line? Obviously, they're making single malts a little different, but to other distilleries and comparing yourself to them, or is it really no? We're focused on what we are doing and doing it the way we want to.
It's more the latter, but I don't think we're certainly. I've grown to appreciate the many different ways to try and run a whiskey distillery because it's a very difficult business. And it is by nature. We have to produce whiskey this year for 2028, 29, 30 is going to be produced this year. And we'd love to be a much bigger company in 5 years. I mean, who wouldn't be? That's how we would imagine good business goes. But somehow we have to afford the production of a bigger company than we are 5 years ahead of schedule. And that is until you have reached that kind of pinnacle level where you're just making a bunch of, any of the really big Kentucky guys, essentially, they ebb and flow their whiskey production just with the market. And they know it'll be fine years down the road. They'll make it work. They're always going to have a massive amount of spirit ready. For us, it's always about how to put down more. And that disconnect is something that all distilleries, including one as big as Sagamore, has to figure out how to do. So I have become, from when I was young and fiery, I certainly have a much different feeling about sourced whiskey, especially if it is in service of transitioning to self-made product. And especially if you can find out a way to do it in a way that puts a unique product in market. I mean, I do believe that there's not a need for another, just 95.5 Indiana rye that has is nothing different except for a brand name. If it is in service of a grander project, though, we all got to try to find a way to keep the doors open. But, we didn't get into this as business people. So I guess what I'm saying is I've become much more kind of understanding as a business person. And to me, we're all in the same, especially the Maryland rye distillers and whiskey producers here. We're all fighting the same battle here, and their success is good for us. So we've always had a great relationship, not only with Sagamore, but Mark and Arch and all the other Maryland people. We helped found the Maryland Distillers Guild. I was on the board for the first 5 years. Eli's now the president. So we're super involved in the community, and we believe in general the rising tide theory. But when we got into it, we were not business people. We were dreamers and enthusiasts. We really wanted to. We got into it as creators, not business people. It didn't make any sense for us to source whiskey because we got into it to make whiskey. We've never had to sell anything that we didn't make. And we've always tried to make things the right way. And a lot of that, like I said earlier, is just a reflection of our sensibilities. After trying a million whiskeys, we never fell in love with one that was not aged in a full barrel. So even though the original business plan was written on, hey, whiskey can be made in 6 months now, this makes this business make a lot more sense. We're just going to do that. By the time the doors opened, we had just realized that no whiskey we loved was a 6-month, 5-gallon barrel. So we weren't going to do it. And that doesn't have to be the case for everybody else, but that's kind of, we went with 53s and we thought that 2 years you could have a good young rye. And so we waited 2 years and I'd say we're happy we did it, but I mean, it was a difficult 2 years. So we've certainly done things the hard way. I always say that we're very bad business people, and we're very good at making whiskey, and that's kind of always what we have been from the beginning. Yeah. So from a business sense, I don't generally I don't have any problem with the way anybody's trying to keep their doors open as long as they are being honest with their customers and create, and ideally putting out good spirit, because that is a different problem. If people are putting out bad spirit, it hurts our industry as a whole, which is also why we think sharing education and things like that's very important for the larger community. But as a creator, of course, like we are entrenched in the idea of that we are doing our own thing. It's kind of our most important identifiable flag in the ground that we have. So we continue to think that we're kind of pushing our own boundaries and improving the thing that we do hard, and we like that we do something that's very very unique, and very few people are willing to do the way we do it.
So I want to come back to the creative aspect in just a second or so. But before we do, I want to jump even further to the four to just cover the process of what you do. So you went through your fermentation. Um, it's I think it's a little more than coincidental in a good way that you found that, hey, some of these distilleries in the past were using these yeast, these mash bills. That was part of why people love Maryland rye. So that fits. I'm curious to what extent, particularly in the fermentation phase, with figuring out using these multiple yeasts, different mashes, how much did Ian's experience as this, master brewer, consultant, etc., play into developing that from the start?
Yeah, so that was Eli. Eli
Oh,
was
I'm sorry,
the
that was Eli.
Yeah, Eli was the head brewer at Peabody Heights Brewery, and I mean, he's an all-star, and he continues to be even more so. I mean, I don't know how we would have really run the thing without him at the beginning. And even though I've done way more distilling now, especially on a large scale, I mean, I've run all the equipment. I've done mashes start to finish. I've done all the runs. If Eli has an emergency and we've got a stripping run that needs to happen, he can call me and I can strap on the rubber boots and go in there and move the mash, fill the still, get the thing going, and do the run. Like, I can do that. But I will tell you that the distance between Eli and myself as distillers has only gotten wider and wider as he has been in control of this thing. So he came in with amazing experience of industrial scale fermentation, warehouse organization, where to source all of our stuff at high quality, how to keep track of a fermentation, temperatures at which we were trying to hold, and the effects that would have on the microbiology and the thing. And we did a lot of experimentation in terms of short fermentation, long, hot, temperature controlled, that kind of thing, to see how it was going to affect the whiskey at the end of the day, because that's kind of was absolutely a missing piece. We had never filled a 53-gallon barrel and waited 2 years to see how these things had come. And we certainly hadn't done it twice to say, change something and see what happened. It's a very long learning process. But at this point, he came in as a great brewer who was able to distill, and we had moonshine together. We understood the kind of how the distilling worked, what to look for, what good spirit versus bad spirit came off. But at this scale, it was a brand new thing. And so there was a ton of learning. In the early days, me and Eli would stare at the still for 14 hours at a time. No one would understand what the original build out was like, and how we piecemealed this thing together. The still wasn't high enough off the ground, so the parrot was about 14 inches off the ground where the spirit would actually come off the condenser. So you couldn't get a tank under there. So we'd have to distill into 5-gallon buckets, and every 30 minutes the bucket would be full. So we'd close the parrot for a brief second, do a quick slide of the bucket out, put a new one in, open the parrot, pick up this 50-pound bucket of spirit, dump it into a tote on a scale. And that happened every 30 minutes. And these runs are, a gin run in the beginning was 16 hours or something like that. So every 30 minutes for 16 hours, you'd you'd be staring. And especially once before we really understood how like the flavor profile would adapt on the way out. So we were still like, in the first runs, we didn't know if the tails cut was going to be 4 hours in or 8 hours in or 10 hours in. And it was a long way in. But we had only done it on this little 10-liter moonshine still. And so we understood the overall arc, but nothing at all to the scale and of that. So on the small still, it's an afternoon. On the big still, the flow does not scale up the same way that the volume scales up. So long, long days. I mean, we were just staring at it. We were tasting it every, 15 minutes, partially because we didn't know where we were at in the run, but also because we were just obsessed with this. I mean, brand new venture, we had to get real good, real fast, and everything was super high stakes. If we had just put out a bad product, one of our products that went straight to market, like Shot Tower Gin, if we had missed on that at the beginning, and completely screwed it up, we wouldn't have made it 6 months. And we were at the very end of our bank account. Everything had to be perfect. So we were incredibly obsessive. But at this point, Eli's gotten certifications in engineering and large scale distillery operations. And I mean, he's a consummate, not only an autodidact, but he's taking certification courses. He's now leading education courses at national distilling gatherings and stuff. I mean, he's a true all-star. I believe Eli has turned into one of the best distillers on the East Coast, and he could help a lot of people with a lot of things, all the way from the microbiology of fermentation to the technical aspects of still systems that he doesn't even use, because we use pot stills, to engineering someone's cooling system. I mean, the guy's an all-star and he's awesome, and I'm happy that I can step in and I can do like the broad sense. Like, I know how to taste for a tails cut. I know what our operations are and what proof it should be, and how to turn the stills on and off when it's running too fast. But like, he is so much deeper than that. So he's a real pro, and he was that at brewing as well, which is why he was such a good and easy fit for the team. I mean, we learned to homebrew together way back in the day when we were just barely out of college, and I think we did a batch in college. So I had already kind of seen his attention to detail firsthand in those days. He was always the more technical between us, and he certainly remains so today.
In hearing you describe him, he comes off uh, a lot like Brian at New Riff, their master distiller, formerly head distiller, now master distiller, and recent guest on the podcast. He came from brewing background, had no distilling experience at all, and is now running New Riff. And I'm just reflecting a bit, because about, I don't know, between 6 months and a year ago, I remember I was having a series of episodes and interviews where the guests were either coming from the wine background or brewing background, and it was very stark. And it felt like there were almost more people coming from the wine side than from the brewing side. Whereas, even though the brewing is more kind of in line with what a distiller ends up doing. But I don't know, just an observation.
It's interesting. Maryland, I think the very first distillery was actually a winery, because the laws allowed for just wineries to make brandy as part of their production process. So I wonder if that is pervasive across other states than Maryland, and which is kind of a nice way to segue into distilling. So some of the early distillers here were wineries who had done brandy before, and then they just were like, oh, distilleries are now a thing. Let's get the broader license and start doing whiskey or gin or whatever. But yeah, it's interesting. Look, coming from wine or coming from beer, you've got a much better chance of pulling off good spirits early than coming from finance. There's certainly the share of people, and hey, no hate, some of them do great, but people who get into it because they think it's sexy, I think, have to have a come to Jesus moment, versus people who have like worked with hoses and wet, rubber boots, and like have gotten stuff all over. They kind of who really understand that this is hard work that requires a lot of attention to get right. So
Sure. And moving to the distillation. So your stills that you have now, if I've researched correctly, you base them. I know you said you drew them, you designed them as a team yourselves, and I do want to talk about how those stills were made, because it's a fascinating story to me. But one of the things that I heard was that they were based in part off of Lagavulin stills.
Conceptually, yeah. So
Yeah.
Lagavulin stills are very short and they're very fat. So in the kind of Scottish realm, they are very low rectification, very high character. I think the polar opposite, if I'm remembering right, would be something like Glenmorangie, which are
Mhm.
very tall, and just rectify very highly. The kind of the taller the still per volume, the more rectification happens on the way up. So the kind of cleaner spirit you get, versus when it's very short and it's a big volume, the spirit does not get to kind of clean up as far on the way up before it goes over the horn and is essentially the finished product. Um, so yeah, we wanted something that would give about as much character as possible. So we found through one of the early distilling forums, which have gotten a lot more professional than they were back then. This guy, James, out in Olympia, Washington, who was building stills for people, and we commissioned the largest still he ever built, which is 250 gallons. And I think the largest one he ever built before or after, because I don't believe he still builds stills. Um, and we talked to him about concept. We sent him some pictures. We got a drawing. We adjusted the drawing, and because it was like he had the classic like rectification bubble, and we were like, no bubble. We were like, we are shooting this thing out about as like dense as it can be. So we did. I have the original drawing here. See if this translates. Oh no,
Wow.
you know what? Yeah. So I have it's based on the original drawing.
Sure.
The line arm and the parrot is all original, and then part of the still has been changed over to a Baltimore monument, which was the original stab at the logo that never took. But yeah, I keep that drawing with me at all times.
Nice. And for listeners, he has a tattoo on his leg, those designs, which is pretty damn impressive. That's a commitment to which I mean, I got my first tattoo earlier this year, so I know it's once you have it on you, you realize how permanent it is. So I
Uh-huh.
understand the commitment to doing that.
I always said if we got open, if we actually pulled this thing off, then I'd get a big old BSC tattoo. So I did.
So you got these squat, I think we can call them stills,
Mhm.
uh, and no no reflux bubble, nothing on there. So it's just straight neck until you get to the line arm. At that point, are you following kind of again a more Scotch like tradition of fairly straight to maybe downward facing line arm and then
Down facing line arm and a worm tub.
worm tub? Okay, yeah, I was going to ask if it was a worm tub or shell and tube. So
Worm tub.
worm tub, awesome. So this is your process and your still set up and such today. The going jumping back to the first edition, that first release of Epoch Rye and EPOCH rye was a little bit different, and it was the first rye that we think had been distilled in Baltimore in about 50 years, um,
At least 50.
at least 50.
Yeah, the timing's a little funny. You can find some distilleries that were around a little more than 50 years ago, but most of them are just on the other side of like the city limits, like in,
Mm-hmm.
Dundalk, which a lot of people consider a suburb of Baltimore, but after a certain point, it's just not in the city limits of Baltimore anymore. And so there was a big operation out there. So could be more like 75 or even 100. It's hard to find the record of the last in the city limit one, because Pikesville was not in the city limits. So that would have been the kind of the last one, which was closer to, 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, a long time and a big deal.
Absolutely.
Um,
And I was gonna say
yeah,
you were adamant that it had to be 2 years, had to be a straight rye, had to be aged as you were saying in standard 53-gallon barrel because the smaller ones just weren't the profile you were going for.
yep.
Um, Now, with that said, right off the bat, you release it, you win a double gold at San Francisco with it
Out of the first barrel.
out of the first barrel, which is pretty. I mean, it's not pretty. It is very impressive to do. And especially since, I mean, you didn't necessarily know how it was going to be at 2 years, even if you're sampling along. So you finally release it. So what made that product such a hit in the first place?
That was, man, that was a big moment. That was our whiskey releases. I think we've put out a lot of amazing whiskey. I think we've put out better whiskey since then, but there was nothing like the energy from the first release. We had a line from our brew floor, down off the brew floor, out of the roll up, and then we had this long driveway that kind of fed up into the freeway, and we had, you know, 500 people in line up out of the driveway, and they started to have to kind of trickle onto the exit. They were
Mhm.
kind of standing on the side of the exit of the freeway in order to kind of stay in line. And we only had about 200 bottles to sell that day. So we kept a couple of bottles behind so that everybody who showed up got to at least taste it. But people were excited about it and they were ready. We had been, we were founded as the Baltimore Whiskey Company, by the way.
Right, right,
So
right.
BWC, and it made a lot of sense to us at the time. But of course, for years and years, we had, farmers markets and events, and we put signs up to the Baltimore Whiskey Company, and every customer would come up and be like, whiskey, huh? And we'd be like, well, it's gin and apple brandy today. And so everybody was, where's the whiskey? Where's the whiskey? Where's the whiskey? And we were like, 2018, it's coming. It's in barrels. We're doing it. I promise. So we had 2 years of just build up and anticipation and nobody being able to try it, or everyone who came in for a tour, we just point at the barrels, there they are. They're coming. So I think it was just the buildup of so many people over so many years, and we'd gotten some good press, because we were an operating distillery in Baltimore. So we were, even though that original space was not the most inviting, had its own charm, and I think people were just kind of charmed by whiskey being back, especially in the early days before it was a little more commonplace. So that was really special, and it really felt like maybe we would pull this thing off in the long run, and maybe we were doing something right when we saw we got double gold at San Fran, and that was a really good feeling. That was San Francisco was, I don't know that it was more competitive than it is now because it was smaller, but the group of people that scored double golds back in those days was much smaller as well. So I think we were one of maybe 11 distilleries that won double gold for rye whiskey that year. And it was like Knob Creek cast strength rye 10-year. And I mean, it was huge distilleries. A lot of it was MGP sourced. And then there was like little old us who literally were sold out already. We sold out in an hour of the only thing we had, and batch two sold out in another hour down the road. It was years before we kind of had a ready stock of it, because we just could not afford to make very much of it. But it was really cool to be tiny little people who had just like, not, sacrificed a bunch of paychecks and sold things to stay open instead, and not being able to afford a new mop, and all this kind of stupid stuff in the early days. Working in a place where the windows didn't close right, so you'd feel the wind blow outside. Our fermenters froze over one year overnight, like because it was so cold in our working conditions. I mean, just like crazy stuff to keep that place going. So that was a really emotional thing, with some loud yelling when we saw it. And we've won double gold now there, I think 4 times, maybe 5 now, with the reserve winning it last year. So we love it. Every time it's a big deal, and it just makes us feel like we're doing something right.
And I should mention I have a bottle of the Maryland Epoch Reserve in front of me, as well as the Maryland Toasted version of that, both of which I've tried. I'll have some tasting notes for it when the episode comes out. But I was incredibly impressed. It's definitely a different take on a Maryland rye. There's much more malty character to it, which personally I really like. Richness, and as you're saying with the still setup, just a generally fuller spirit, I
It's
would say.
a it's a
Yeah, there's more flavor
broad
in there.
spectrum flavor profile, and that's generally when people ask me the difference between pot distilling and column. In a pot still, as the spirit kind of, or sorry, in a column, when it travels up the column, you kind of decide at which height you want to pull it off, and kind of which note is your spirit, and that it generally comes off that way the whole run, whether it's a continuous still or it's a batch, like a hybrid. You're kind of going to get that proof and that spirit the whole time. So it's a really focused flavor profile, and that can be really awesome. In a pot still, the proof drops the entire run, in our case, about a 12 hours worth of proof drop. And at each different proof, you're pulling a different flavor profile off the still because the boiling point in the still is being adjusted from the lack of alcohol. Different flavor profiles are evaporating with the different heat. And so you create this and then it's the aggregate of that 12 hours that creates your spirit. So it is a broad spectrum flavor profile spirit rather than a very focused one. So certainly complex, and some people are into it and some people aren't, but we certainly think it's pretty cool.
No, I certainly enjoyed it, and it made me think. Obviously, I haven't tried that initial batch that came off. I don't even know if there's any of that left to
There
try.
are a handful of places to find it, but most of them are generally locked.
Fair enough. But so I have to ask though, you're coming out with this first release. You win double gold at San Francisco right off the bat. You're selling out batches immediately before even you know about the award. But the version today is not exactly the same as the first batch, and not just because it's older. The two bottles that I've got in front of me both say this whiskey is over 4 years old, as opposed to the two. But as I understand it, there have been different changes to the product itself since that initial batch.
Yeah. The very first fermentation was the very first fermentation. So, I mean, the first barrels that came out, I should say, was literally the first fermentation. So it's not like we had a lot of 20 barrels that were all two, and we chose two of them to be the first batch. Like the first batch was the first whiskey we made, was the first whiskey off the still, thus the first whiskey in barrels and the first that came out. So we have adjusted over time a lot. I mean, the mash bill is the same. It's always been 75% rye, 75% unmalted rye, 25% malted rye. Now has that maybe changed from like 73 to 27, depending on especially in the beginning, we didn't have a mill, we were using bags. So if we were going to adjust the overall amount of grain because we were like, maybe if we start at a lower initial gravity, we'll get a better fermentation. Then you can't drop both bags equally without messing with the percentages there. So there may have been like a bag difference on either side of the percent from time to time. And now we have a mill, so it's really dialed in, and we just do it all by weight. And then of course, the brewery that we were pulling the yeast from originally, when we moved into the larger location, we switched from 500-gallon fermentations to 1,000-gallon fermentations. So they couldn't really reliably source that much yeast off the bottom of their fermenter twice a week, which is kind of what we were producing there. So we had to find a replacement yeast for that. And so that was 3787, if anyone's curious out there. And we couldn't just buy that in bulk because that's a liquid yeast. So you have to cultivate it, or else you're going to spend thousands of dollars every batch on yeast, which is not viable. So we looked for an alternative, and we did a number of different experiments with other dry Belgian ale yeast that we could source and just use directly from the packaging. And that was really fun because we tried something that we didn't end up going with because we could tell the white whiskey was significantly different from what we were used to capturing. But we still put those in barrel, and so now we've got to try them when they are 4 and older, and we have gotten some really cool whiskeys out of them, even though they're a different flavor profile than Epic. Yeast, there was almost, I'm not sure that I have anything that I think is more fun than screwing with the yeast. I just do it all the same and change the yeast and see how that whiskey comes out, and it's wildly different and a ton of fun. So we did get some of that, but the yeast we ended up going with really, really similar. I mean, similar enough to where I think if you put 5 and 5 in front of me of both, I'd just get them mixed up. Whereas a lot of these other yeasts, I would nail them every time. So the whiskey we're making now is very similar. We also used to pull an American ale yeast from a different brewery, and we've ended up changing that to an American whiskey yeast for that second profile, which we do fewer fermentations with that. We do most of our fermentations with the Belgian ale yeast. That's similar but a little different. So yeah, we've messed with some things. All in all, I think if you had the first bottle of Epic and one of the current 2-year Epics, you would understand that they're the same whiskey, even if they are not one-to-one clones of one another. So there's been some flavor drift as we've had to kind of adjust for our current situation. But I also think that the whiskey we make has gotten in general better and better. So we're not pining for some way to propagate our own use so we can move back to 3787. We think we found a natural place for us to be that is essentially the same thing, but close. And once again, we have messed with other things. We've messed with the total amount of grain. And short fermentations versus long fermentations versus, from time to time, an extra long fermentation. We've certainly had our share of problems. And so trying different methods on where and when to do our sanitation with our wooden vats, we kind of wondered whether we were seeing a pH drop in our fermentation late because we were carrying too much natural fermentation in too early. So like, can we neutralize that a little better on the front end? So we're certainly not without our troubleshooting, which has always ended up changing process, but generally we believe we've changed processes for the better. So we get better fermentations now that are coming out, closer to have fermenting out all the sugar than the original batches. So I think our processes were good enough at the beginning to where we were putting some awesome stuff in the still and had a really cool still setup and being really careful with the heads and tails cuts, really deep heads cuts, really conservative tails cuts, to where some of that is certainly responsible for the quality of whiskey we had then. But I don't think we've lost any of the magic. I think we've only kind of dialed into a better process since then.
Jordan, I mean, I really only bring that up just because I think if you had kind of stuck with what worked originally, a lot of distilleries have kind of done that. They figure out the first product that works well and stick with it, and some don't evolve past that. Now, as you've said, you had different circumstances in yours, both in scaling up and in process and such. So it wasn't let's put it this way, some changes were your choice, some were kind of made for you.
Environmental, yeah.
Yeah.
And I will say, essentially all credit to Eli. I think a lot of distilleries, unless you have a lot of experience, aren't going to catch some of these problems as needing to be addressed. I mean, certainly where your yeast comes from, but realizing that your pH is like, could be the thing responsible for an extra 2 points of gravity, and that your quality could go up if you could solve that, and where those problems might be happening. That's all Eli's technical know-how and QC stuff that he's really good at.
So to follow that through with, I want to ask just a bit about awards and competitions. So I've heard you speak on the topic before, and I like the way you think about them. Right on the website, you go to the homepage of Baltimore Spirits Company, and the awards are there from San Francisco, from New York, Maryland Distillery of the Year from New York, but also right on that homepage is the medals and the line, "We don't count bronze." Yeah. Now, we've talked about award shows a couple of times on the podcast, not too much, but some. And to me, that's a very strong statement, and really like a metal plated gauntlet thrown down on the table of like, we're not going to count this level of award. So I'm curious what your inspiration was to kind of put that out there.
It's a little cocky. I appreciate how deep you've gone into understanding what I've said in the past. Most places are just kind of starting from scratch when they interview, so this is more fun.
That is my favorite thing to hear, I can tell you now. So
I think people who put as much effort into doing questions must be pretty self-aware that they're doing that. So yeah, pretty great. We don't count bronze. So there's a couple of things about awards, which is, I think once your spirits are a good enough quality, you put them into an award show, and they may get double gold and they may get nothing at all, but you have a shot at something really good. But you have to be of a certain quality to have a shot at the double gold, but it doesn't mean you're going to get it. I mean, they are not, I don't find uh, competitions reliable in terms of reproducing results. I think if you had all the same dudes and all the same whiskeys do it 10 times over the year, you'd just have a wild scattering of who won what, because it's hard to taste that many whiskeys in a day. What order are you tasting in? What did you taste right before that? You know, like that makes a massive difference. What'd you eat that day? And a lot of these people are really professional and they will have not eaten anything for a number of hours and not had any coffee. And I know one guy that plucks his nose hair before doing any serious nosing. I think he's a fairly unique case.
That's a new one for me. I'll admit that's
Yeah, he does not cut it. He pulls them.
oh god.
It's the worst thing to think about.
That's what
Anyways,
actors do in Hollywood when they need to cry.
yeah, I certainly cry when I do it.
Yeah.
So I do think that in some ways you shouldn't take it personally when you don't leave with the medal that you want. But it is nice, you know, when you do win, it's hard not to be excited about it. Though we don't count bronze, there's also in a lot of these award shows, if you look at total entries and then total medals, when it's over half, it's kind of hard. Hang on. It's kind of hard. So in some ways, you're not, if somebody likes something and they give it an 82 or whatever that ends up being bronze, there's a lot of good spirits out there. And so there end up being a lot of awards, but at some point it might just be the fact that I don't feel as if just being in the top 75% is an award. It doesn't mean it's not that you're not doing a good job or you can't be proud of it. And but you know, you kind of believe if I put in a spirit into competition, I want a gold and I want a double gold. I want everyone to believe that. And I'm not putting a spirit in there that I don't think deserves it. I mean, I am really passionate about our quality of spirit. I am a true believer. I am an acolyte. Like I get mad when we win silver, and I almost don't want to talk about getting silvers because what's there to, you're going to say that it was second best to a whole like multiple categories of people out there. But you know, when you're young, getting any recognition is awesome. But and so like I get a little bit, I generally don't share silvers either. But when we were kind of putting together the website, I do keep a spreadsheet, everything we've ever entered and what the results were, so that whenever I need to come up with some superlative on talking about our quality and stuff, I can be like, how many golds are we at now? And I can go and read them and stuff. And I keep track of the bronzes. But at some point we were kind of deciding on which medals to put out on the website, because that was a fairly, you know, we redesigned that in 2018. I was going through all the things and I was just like, I just don't want to be like, and we've won 14 bronze medals. Like, yeah, but maybe that's just because I understand the inner workings of these things and I know how many bronzes are being given out, and I just don't think they're all that much to write home about. It's better than not winning anything, and it's not something to like, if somebody else wins a bronze, I do not think that means it's not a good spirit. You know, I've won a bunch of them, so it's not that. And some people think that I'm like poo-pooing other people's bronze medal winning spirits. That's not the case. I've won plenty of them, but it's just a disappointment to me. I know what I'm after there. And so, yeah, just don't do it. Don't count bronze medals. We're in it to win it. I think everyone who enters the spirits competitions are getting in there to win them. Like we have always wanted to play with the big boys. That has been such a big thing for us. We are not trying to be cute. We had to start in extremely meager circumstances, and now we're in like a little middle of the road circumstance. Nothing I would say is physically like impressive where you walk in and you're just like big, you know. It's like and there's places like that. Sagamore is fucking awesome, you know, like you walk in and you've got this 40-foot still and you got the cool walking tour and a beautiful waterfront. I mean, like that is an impressive, awesome building. And we don't have that yet, but we are on our way. But that's, I mean, we want the long-term big deal. We always want to like be trouble for the big guys. So like I want to take your double gold spots. And I want to see giant brands and tiny us there. And I want to be a pain in the butt to all these guys. And that's why we do this. I think we're all the owners are pretty competitive people. And like we got into this to do it right. And we have a tiny bit of spite about us about doing it that way. And I think that's kind of partly why we don't count bronze medals.
It's to me that thought process makes plenty of sense. I don't, again, I'm probably talking for the top, I don't know what, 0.5, maybe 1% of whiskey drinkers that are going to be, and that's not to say like the best whiskey drink. I'm just the 1% that's going to be looking at a label and is going to know that a bronze medal doesn't mean you came in third out of three. It means something different, or silver being second, as you were saying. So, not that it doesn't mean it's a bad spirit at all. It means it won awards, but because we're accustomed to like the Olympic style scoring of this, a bronze can look very attractive on a packaging or a sales slip or something like that. As can, a high point score. And I guess just as a quick follow up, you say you don't count bronzes officially, let's say. How do you feel about point scores?
It kind of depends where they're from for me. I have a ton of respect for the BTI guys, the Beverage Tasting Institute. It's actually the oldest spirits ranking system, maybe in the world, but definitely in the US. They operate out of Chicago, and they have really dialed in a very interesting and very replicable ranking systems where it is not just like they force the tasters to qualify, not just quantify their answers in these written out categories. And they have found that if they use the same spirit with the same tasters or different tasters and they do it over again, they get replicable results where they score very similarly every time. And I really like the way they do it. So the BTI guys, I think, do it right. Anything else, I have some questions about. And once again, you're talking generally about, especially for something like, I don't know, you use Wine Enthusiast or something like that. That may be one taster. And as somebody who knows his whiskey almost every day, I can't tell you how much variance in the same spirit I get. Some days I have days where I don't like our whiskey, where I'm just like nosing it and it's just not there, and maybe I have a cold or maybe I ate something weird or maybe I think something's coming off hot because I ate spicy food the night before and I don't realize that my tongue is still on fire. I mean, there's just so much variance in that stuff that it should all be taken with a grain of salt. And at the end of the day, you should make your own opinions. And I think, I mean, as a whiskey drinker, nothing gets me more excited than somebody doing something new. If a new brand comes out with sourced whiskey and I know where it's from and I know I've had it, I'm not compelled to buy that bottle. In terms of just generic bottle on the shelf, if I meet a guy and he's super excited and, I'm not saying that none of these guys are worth anybody's time, but what gets me excited is if I know someone is doing a mash bill I've never had on a system that, it kind of doesn't even matter, honestly. If someone's doing a mash bill I've never had and they're making the whiskey and it's aged appropriately, I'm interested in trying it. And then if they actually did it well, meaning a good fermentation and they know how to kind of pull the right spirit off the still, I'm going to be super excited about it when I drink it. So, I mean, that's what gets me going. And so if I start reading about things like that, that's what will compel me to go out and seek out a bottle or purchase something. Something like kind of at the high level, like the Todd Leopold triple chamber still is like a great example where it's like, I know I've never had something like that. It's like, I must try it. And that's been awesome. Lucky to drink some of that with Todd. In terms of the rankings and stuff, I think if you are looking for things, don't go off one number. If you want to research some things, you're not positive you want to drop the money, or if you like to get into the details, go aggregate. We've got good reviews and bad reviews, but if you look at them all, you'll see a lot more excitement and kind of big good reviews than you will see people who are just kind of so-so on it. But like I said, I've been so-so about some of our spirits, and of course, some of those spirits were not so-so at all. I mean, then the next day you come back and you're like, I'm an idiot. This is amazing, and get a whole different thing. So it's hard because everyone is, those people are still responsible for giving their best opinion. I think they're doing their best, but I just don't think any one opinion is necessarily the right one.
I like it. So as we're moving into our kind of last third in terms of our time, there's still, so much to get to. I don't know if we'll get to all of it, but I'll do my absolute best to
Machine gun
go
round.
through. Yeah. So I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about some of your non-whiskey products. And you alluded to this just now, that not everything you produce is a whiskey. And you said earlier you had apple brandy before the whiskey was ready, because apple brandy was faster to make, and you could put it out earlier. So starting with the apple brandies, and with that I'm including the apple brandy liqueur that you make. You've got Pechuga style. You've got the green is gold apple brandy, the liqueur, as I said. The thing that, well, first I got to ask, what is a Pechuga?
Yes. To understand the Pechuga, you must understand the fumus. To understand the fumus, you must understand mezcal. So, all right, this is not going to be a short answer.
Go for it.
Our Fumus Pamela, these are terrible names, and I'm responsible for them. I'd like to just get that out to the people. This is the worst brand that we have, and it's my fault in terms of the actual physical branding. But we rebranded them once into this, and it's just too much work to do it again. The Fumus Pumila is a smoked apple brandy, and that's, of course, based on its Latin roots, fumus, fire. Pumila is the apple tree. So it's a smoked apple brandy that we distill like a mezcal. And we did this because we're nerds, and we used to have to sit around the still for about 14 hours a day. And sometimes you start talking about nerdy things and crazy ideas happen. And one thing leads to another because there's only 2 people in the company and there's not a lot of people to say no. So this is how this whole thing came about. We're talking about mezcal. We love mezcal. We were drinking a lot of mezcal and really exploring the category in those days. And mezcal is essentially a smoked fruit brandy made from the agave fruit. Not a lot of people think about it as a fruit brandy. They kind of think about it as its own thing. But it is a fruit brandy. And we had already done a little bit of apple brandy. We had put down a barrel for the Green is Gold, which was not yet out. But we love mezcal. And we were talking about the production process, which was so unique. And we were talking about, is this something you could do with apples? I mean, in mezcal, you have to cook the agave to kind of convert the starches into sugars and make it distillable. And you don't have to do that with apples, but maybe in the peels or something, there's some sort of starch that can be converted, or underripe apples or non-sweet apples, but kind of didn't matter. We just got this in our head that maybe we could distill an apple brandy like a mezcal and kind of combine these very old North American fruit brandy traditions and see what happened. So we brought in 1,000 gallons of apple juice. And when we brought it, we said, hey, can you give us all of the leftover like peels, cores, and smush from the pressing to our
pomace,
orchard, right? All the pomace. So they agreed, and they gave us this giant tub of the stuff, which we took over in the original days. We don't do this anymore. We have our own smoker. The original days, we hauled it all over to our local barbecue joint. And Dave over at Blue Pit was nice enough to let me sit outside in the dark, kind of in non-operational hours, and spend 6 hours smoking apple peels back there. So smoking all the apple pomace on this giant industrial smoker, bringing it back, dumping it in the fermentation, and do this long 10-day fermentation on the smoked apple solids. After that's fully fermented, you end up with this beautiful smoked cider, which if I ever open a cider business, we will have a smoked cider because of how good this is. We throw it in the stills, and we throw all the solids in the stills with it. And then we do double copper pot distillation. So we do a stripping run, collect the spirit, put it back in. Stripping run, then the spirit run. Now in mezcal spirit runs, they're very interesting because they don't really do a tails cut. So as I mentioned before, when you're distilling on a pot still, the proof drops over time as what's left in the still becomes more and more watery. And in mezcal, you actually most traditionally distill all the way and then down to where it's coming off at a very, very low proof. And you use the low proof runnings of the still to bring it down to bottling proof, which is also how Pisco is made, although Pisco tends to be in one pass, not double. But mezcal often double distilled and often in copper pots. So this is like a really similar thing that we're doing. And it turns out really late in the run, when the temperature in the still is running really hot because it's mostly water, is when you get the most dense and expressive smoke phenols, because they're very heavy particles. So they come out really late in the run, generally where you wouldn't be collecting if you were doing a traditional apple brandy, because a traditional apple brandy, you would do the heart's cut, where you're only collecting the middle of the spirit and you're not collecting all of these low proof end runnings. So we just winged it, did this double copper pot still thing, distilled it down until it was like 102 proof, I think, on the original batch, where the aggregate was 102. Called it a day. I mean, that was down to almost near water coming out. And it was awesome. The smoke character is a lot like a mezcal smoke character, and that's because we're collecting that same part of the spirit, when mezcal is kind of the only place that's doing that. So it is really cool. It really does drink like a mezcal apple brandy. It's really wild. So that's the Fumas. Asamina Pumila, which is the Pechuga, please excuse the branding once again, is also based on mezcal culture. So a mezcal producer once a year would generally distill a Pechuga. And a Pechuga is the celebration of their harvest of the land around them. So they'll go out and gather their local fruits and nuts and spices. They throw them all in the still with their mezcal, and they redistill it, most traditionally with a raw turkey breast or multiple raw turkey breasts hung in the still. Pechuga means breast in Spanish, but very specifically like a chicken breast or a turkey breast, like it's something from an animal. And they do that because your animals are part of your harvest. Like, this is part of what the land gives to you and your family to feed your family and give you sustenance. And so you're kind of creating this aggregate celebration of that into a mezcal. And this is their like most precious product. It's what you would drink at a wedding, or like when very old friends come over, like you pull out the Pechuga, it's the extra special thing. Since mezcal producers do that, and we are doing this cool mezcal style apple brandy, we got in our heads that we should definitely do a Maryland style Pechuga to celebrate the Maryland harvest. We didn't want to go out and do like pineapple and rice and do like a Mexican Pechuga in Maryland, because that's not what a Pechuga is. We wanted to kind of stay really true to the project, because we're very kind of reverent of the mezcal makers. So we went out and harvested wild American pawpaws, wild American persimmons, and wild black walnuts, all of which are native to Maryland. We threw them in the still with our smoked apple brandy, and we hang a Maryland country ham in the still, about a 30-pound salt-cured bone-in Maryland country ham. There's some precedent for that. There is most traditionally turkey breast, as I mentioned, for Mexican mezcal, but there's also, you see iguana, venison, rabbit, chicken, and there is an Iberico ham one as well. So we figured it was Maryland. It was either the salt-cured Maryland ham or crab, and we thought crab sounded disgusting, and we are not into making disgusting things. So we went with the ham. Turns out it's awesome. Everybody who tries this thing loves it. There is no market for it, really. But the people who love it just adore it. And every time you tell that story, and then people actually sip it and see how good it is, and also how much you can like taste the things in there. It's extra fruity, it's extra custardy from the pawpaw. You get this rich black walnut thing that's like, you can find the kind of nocino notes in there. And you get an absolute kind of prosciutto-y salt thing going on in there that's awesome. So that's the Pechuga. Long
I'm
answer.
dying to try that.
It's awesome.
That sounds incredible. And I'm curious, because you're on the whiskey side, you're so focused on this traditional style of distilling, the Maryland rye traditions. As you said, that we've got a a North American tradition of these fruit brandies, tracing back also to European fruit brandies, the Schlivovitzes and things like that. Did Maryland specifically, or Baltimore, or the state as a whole, have any kind of quirks about their traditions of making fruit brandies or apple brandies?
None that we know of. The whole Northeast was apple country going way, way back. And, a lot of people think of Maryland, of rye whiskey in general, as the original American spirit. But the truth is apple brandy goes back even further. Apple brandy and rum both were distilled in America before rye whiskey really took off. They were bigger in the colonies. And it makes sense. You can just put apple juice in a bucket and it turns into alcohol. Like it is the easiest thing in the world to stumble upon. So it makes sense that most places with a distilling history have a very old fruit brandy because fruit brandy is just the easiest thing to stumble upon in the world.
Right.
Um, but no, we don't think that there's sort of like process history to Maryland apple brandy, but it certainly existed, as did gin. People think of Maryland as a rye state, and of course it was the biggest thing, but even the distilleries back then generally were putting out multiple spirits. The original recipe for the aviation, the first time it was in print in a cocktail book, calls for L. Bart's gin. And if you Google L. Bart's gin, you can find a historic label, and at the bottom it says distilled in Baltimore.
There's so I'm actually going to skip the next question just for time, but I want to just tell you what it was because it relates to exactly what you just said, which is that rye is seeing a resurgence or saw a resurgence, let's say 15 years ago and forward, largely on the back of this craft cocktail movement. We see mixologists, bartenders creating these new cocktails and reviving older ones, with the aviation being one of them. And I was going to ask, in a way, like, is Baltimore more of a kind of cocktail town versus a straight pour town? But instead, I'd rather just point people to your site where you have a lot of great cocktail recipes. I tried a couple of them, and I'm not a huge cocktail at home person because I just don't usually have I
Sure.
don't have an orange that I can just peel and just like throw away the rest of it. But I want to point to the cocktail recipes, but also to another product that I'm just going to have to skip over for time's sake, but the Baltimoros, which look absolutely delicious. And one in particular, which I know is a bestseller of yours, the Szechuan one.
It's
And
very cool.
yeah, so I definitely encourage people to visit the website, take a look at those, and try them if you are nearby. Order them if you're not nearby because it they look just they look really interesting, and it's a different flavor. How much do you have a spiced? How many times do you have a spicy cocktail that's not just someone throwing a jalapeno in the mixer? You know, you want something a little bit different, a little numbing. So that's going to be something on my shopping list right after the Pechuga. I'll be the market for it if we need to.
No, absolutely. I
Uh,
look forward to hearing your opinions. Can't wait.
yeah. So with just a couple of questions left, I wanted to start rounding us out with um, your you coming back to the creative point that you said earlier. So you move out of the initial space pretty soon after starting, just because of space considerations, need a larger room, and moved into the Union Collective, which is this space of kind of, if you've been to New York, it reminded me a lot in pictures of Chelsea Market and places like that, food halls with different vendors and all these things going on. But this place where there's a creative atmosphere of artisans, food, drink, everything in the middle. Uh, what led you to choosing that space in particular? Let's start with that. What led you to choose that space in particular?
Yeah, Union Brewing used to be right around the corner from our original location, and they were founded a couple of years before us. And they actually approached us and they said, "Hey, this is a bit of a secret, but we're going to leave our small spot. We have this really cool building that we're looking for like-minded uh, companies that we love to come in here and share this space and kind of create this big community of businesses." And we didn't really think it was possible at the time, so we didn't have any money. Um, and we were still, we were about 2 years old from Open Doors at that point, maybe a little older. But I went to the meeting and went and saw the building and did the walkthrough and heard the whole pitch and just walked out of there thinking, well, this has to happen. This is just like an opportunity like this. If we wait another year, which was the plan, or maybe two, just isn't going to be there. They're going to find some other distillery because I know they want a distillery in there, and I'm going to be furious. So they came to us, and the pitch was good, and so we became one of the founding members of the Union Collective.
And with this, I know you just in passing said earlier that you may be looking for a larger space to increase production, and I know you're going to need a warehouse soon, I think. as well. So, do you envision, if you can tell us, do you envision staying in the Union Collective for the long term with another outpost, or do you think it'll necessitate a full move out?
We have no immediate plans to leave the Union Collective, but our long-term vision has always been to be the premier rye whiskey distillery on the East Coast. And at some point, I think we would need to own our own space in order to do so. Yeah, I don't think anybody feels 100% stable and permanent if their lease isn't under their control, unless they have some bizarre 50-year grant from the state or something. So, yeah, I don't know when it'll happen, and it's not something that we're trying to accomplish tomorrow, but that remains in our mission statement, and it remains what our long-term goal is. That's what we want.
With two more for you. So, going back also, Maryland Distillers Guild. You were on the board 5 years, said Eli's now the president. Being the founding member, one of the founding members of this guild, I'm curious, to put it bluntly, what it was like to start a distillers guild, and if you felt a certain responsibility to be a founding member.
Yes. So founding the guild was a lot easier than you might think just because we had a great situation. There was it's not exactly a lobbyist group, although they did help us organize our own lobbying efforts with the government to get some local laws changed. And we've had a lot of success with that over the last 10 years. But essentially, there's a group that has helped the beer guild and then the wine guild, which are older in Maryland, accomplish a lot. And once the distilleries kind of started popping up, and there were maybe two that were actually open and 10-ish that were in planning that were kind of getting there. They just kind of sent out an invitation, hey, come meet. We guys think you should be a guild. And the leader of that, Kevin Addix, who's now the Secretary of Agriculture in Maryland, helped us organize the articles of incorporation, or it's probably not the exact right to the articles of organization since it is a nonprofit, and choose our first board, lay down all the kind of the laws that we were going to follow in the board, and help us get organized. And he helped us run our meetings for the first couple of years. So I was the treasurer for the first 5 years, which is, I wouldn't say I did a lot of treasuring, but because we didn't have a ton of money, we're not a big money operation. There were very limited amounts of us. But it did mean that I was at all the board meetings because it was just kind of a team effort. And we accomplished a ton. And literally, we changed laws that allowed us to stay open. We got in 2016, we passed a law that allowed us to sell at local farmers markets. And we've kind of already spoken about how important that was. And I literally don't know for certain how we would have survived year two had we not been able to get in the farmers markets. It was a huge source of revenue for us. I mean, small revenue, but $1,000 a week between a couple of markets was a massive difference for us in terms of just being able to pay rent through the end of the year. So things like that. And we've gotten massive other things changed. We have a cocktail room now because we got a law change that allows us to do cocktails. We've gotten all sorts of small and large things. I'm down in the Capitol every year talking about bills and testifying in front of committees, and that's been amazing. And we formed the guild, and I joined the board because we've always wanted to be leaders in our industry and wanted to be a voice in the room, and that continues now. And now that there's something like 40 distillery licenses in Maryland now. I mean, it's a massive explosion. And we feel like we're part of this original crop that remains very engaged and has helped kind of accomplish a ton and helps new distilleries not only start up, but kind of join the conversation. And I do feel responsibility to get more people involved, because when you enter into a structure that already exists, you kind of feel like things just happen. Laws just changed. We have a guild. It's a thing. Some people don't show up to meetings, and they don't understand that like we're just not very far removed from where there was just a handful of us trying to do this, and more voices make such a difference. And you can be very involved. You don't have to be an OG distiller to like go and show your face and meet politicians and also like create what, like we need people to have goals and what we do want to change. We want our business to evolve, so we need people engaged. So I do think the original group is still kind of a driving force there, but sometimes not just a driving force in the decision making, but a driving force in getting new distilleries involved and understanding that this is something that we do ourselves, and that like being involved is very important. So I do. It's the guild is near and dear to my heart. I'm very happy Eli's the president. A lot of work for him this year, but it's really good, and it remains just a powerful force in helping our industry, even though we're still not very big, all things considered.
And then just to close us out, my last question, which I've been asking more and more frequently, and I think I'm going to start ending on this question kind of officially at
This
this
is like
point.
your
Yeah,
your thing.
big close. Yeah, it's not particularly unique. It's just something I'm very interested in, which is you already talked about. You want BSC to become the premier rye distillery, certainly in the Northeast, Mid Atlantic, in the region, and be known farther than that, I would assume, for making this special rye. You and your partners are also not old guys; like you're pretty young guys for the industry. So this may be looking far in advance, but I'm very curious with people who come on to know what they want their legacy to be, and if what they want the legacy to be has changed at all since the business started.
Yeah. When I am old, very old, I would like to see Epic Rye on a shelf when I am not involved in the company. Um, I this is not I'm not I don't think any of us have exit plans in our 40s or 50s. And I've got a few more months in my 30s, if I do say so myself. Um, that's not what I mean, but we're trying to start something that will last longer than us, I guess is the point that I'm trying to make. Yeah, we don't want this company to live and die with the founders. We want to turn it into something really special and stay with it as long as we can. Um, but I do seeing it after I'm not involved and seeing it live on kind of beyond me is like a moment I hope I get to experience, because I've thought about it a lot, oddly enough, as kind of that's what it looks like when it works to me, is that when I'm like old and out of the game, um, that I see it doing things and I can be like, yeah, that was us. That was awesome. So, um, does that answer your question? I've just
Yeah,
that's a moment that's a big that I just have spent a long time thinking about as kind of that'll mean we did it to me. Uh, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So with that, Max, thank you so much for taking the time tonight to come on and tell us all about Baltimore Spirits Company, formerly known as, or also known as on the business paperwork, Baltimore Whiskey Company. Um, Hang on with me for just a minute after we finish recording. You can find Baltimore Spirits Company, their website, all their social media handles, and anywhere to find them in the show notes for this episode. We'll link directly to them. Thank you again for listening. Please rate and subscribe wherever you listen, and I will see you all next week.